Ladies and gentlemen, delegates of the AVPN Global Conference, please do take your seats. We are about to begin with a panel session titled Achieving Impact Beyond Scale, the Imperative of Field Building. Now, if you're still at the foyer and you can still hear my voice, we are here coming to you live from the plenary hall. And we're happy to bring you more events to come throughout these 3 days. 100 events await you, and this is one of the ones that we look forward to. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you're ready now for the panel session titled Achieving Impact Beyond Scale, the Imperative of Field Building. On the stage now, we are joined by incredible panelists, I'm very sure. We have Leah Farnham, who would also be moderating this panel session, Elizabeth Gillies, Nader Shams, Yani Peng, and Neera Nandi. And with that, Leah, over to you.
Thank you. Welcome. It is a privilege to be with you all today. It is a privilege to be seated next to this truly incredible panel. We will get to hear from each of them in a moment. First, I want to reiterate what this session is called, Achieving Impact Beyond Scale, the Imperative of Field Building. And I want to zoom in on the word imperative for a moment, because I wrote down across the morning and early afternoon sessions at least 20, probably many more. These were only the sessions I actually got to be in. 20 massive, urgent, systemic, complex problems and crises that we are facing. So what is your all's imperative for being here at AVPN? Mine, and I suspect this is true for many of you all, is to find new approaches and solutions and collaborate and meet people who are like-minded, also seeking to solve and find new approaches to these really complex crises and social and environmental problems. And so that's what we're here to talk about today. How do we solve problems like hunger and nutrition, climate adaptation and change, education, many of the 20 and more than 20 massive complex problems that we've heard about in today's session so far? We at Bridgespan are a nonprofit advisory organization. We collaborate with other NGOs and nonprofits, donors, and investors to accelerate learning and impact. And we recently launched a multi-year initiative in partnership with two of my colleagues on stage, Nader at the Skoll Foundation and Liz from the Menzies Foundation, as well as a few other funders, to really study and interrogate and provide thought leadership and influence in the philanthropic sector in particular on this notion of field building. And this idea of field building, we will talk more about it in this session, is meant to be a practical application and approach of some of the big ideas we've been hearing about across the morning. Field building is an approach to equitable systems change. But before I go further, we want to pause and learn a bit more about who we have in the audience. And we are going to attempt to do this with some technology, which I think, let's see. Nope, gonna go back to that. Okay. Audience poll, if you all are willing to take out your phones and snap this QR code, the poll will ask you if you are from an organization that is a funding organization, if you are a social change or NGO leader, and how do you think about this notion of systems change? Are you curious and newer to the idea, or do you see yourself as a systems change funder or systems change leader? And while you all select your choice, I am going to potentially see on my phone the results. We were joking with technology. Sometimes it's so smooth and it totally works, and sometimes it just doesn't. Let's see. Give it one more second. No, that did not work. So I am going to instead, oh, did it work on your phone? Okay. Ashima to the rescue. All right, in our audience, 43% of you all are NGO or social change organizations pursuing systems change. 38% are funders pursuing systems change. 14% are funders and the idea of systems change is newer to you. And 5% are NGO social change organizations and the idea of systems change is newer. Okay, so we're vast majority embracing and applying this lens of systems change to the work. Thank you for sharing that. So let me talk a bit more about what we mean by field building as an approach, and then introduce my panelists to start to animate and add some color. So the idea of field building is a whole ecosystem of change makers coming together to solve a massive social problem. It requires coordination, it requires collaboration. It's really this idea that it's the power of the diversity of the ecosystem working in concert such that the proverbial whole is greater than the sum of parts. So Liz, I would love to turn to you first. I know you have embraced this notion of field building for systems change in your work at the Menzies Foundation in Australia. Would love to hear a story from that work, what it looks like, and the impact you're seeing.
I'm just so delighted to be sitting here with a panel who I think are genuinely dealing with, I think, one of the biggest questions that emerged in the context of the conference for me. And that is, when we think about the work that each of us, from an NGO perspective, from a funding perspective, from a capital perspective, what difference we're making in the world and what we can truly hold ourselves to account for, I wonder if you describe that contribution in terms of how many grants you make, how many recipients receive those grants, how much capital you spend. But the problem is, it doesn't matter how many grants we make or how many individuals' lives we impact. It doesn't matter how much capital we allocate. In this context of meta-crises that Leah's spoken about today, we fundamentally have to work in deep collaboration. We have to broker the spaces in between siloed thinking in order to solve these problems at scale. And the reason the Menzies Foundation is so attracted to this idea of field building is this is really difficult work. Where you start, how you conceptualise it, what are the sorts of things you need to fund in order to build these platforms for change. But we think this is at the absolute threshold of what new thinking and practice is around social change agendas. And we deeply hope that our contribution in this work encourages others to think in that way. So often I think the response of people to say is, well, we're too small to make a difference in this way, or we don't see the system, we don't know how to do the work. I think the first point that needs to be made is it's incumbent on all of us to understand how we fit into the system and the contribution we're going to make. It's incumbent on all of us to deepen our understanding of what genuine systems thinking is and systems platforms are, and to hold ourselves to account for the contributions we can make in that regard. So my interest in this is, I think this is a lens that is relevant to all of us. I think it is a lens that requires us to work outside of what we know and who we are, to work in emergence and uncertainty, and to think deeply about how the work of Bridgespan and others can inform us to engage in ways that deliver more impact and address problems at scale. Because words like extinction are increasingly part of the dialogue, and if we don't do that, we're just going to spin our wheels, I think, without actually making the contribution that needs to address these problems.
Thank you, Liz. You know, this notion of field building and what it actually means and what the work looks like, Liz, what you're describing, and I think about an analog, we think about capacity building and how important that is for funders to be investing in often single organizations building their capacity to do their work. Field building is kind of that on steroids across a whole ecosystem. It's about building the capacity of a whole field to achieve its objectives. In our research on field building, successful field building efforts lead to these 5 observable characteristics. Firstly, a knowledge base that actually teaches us from both a practical and applied sense and from a basic knowledge and scientific sense, the nature of the problem, how communities are experiencing the problem, how, the nature of the systemic problem and potential levers to address the problem, so that shared knowledge base. Secondly, a group of actors that is working again in complementary and myriad ways to solve the problem. Thirdly, infrastructure, and I'll come back to that. But this coordination and cohesion across a field doesn't happen by magic. That space in between that you named, Liz, is very much about field level infrastructure, bringing actors together. Fourthly, an agenda and a shared agenda. And again, that infrastructure can often help to create a set agenda and vision for a field. And then lastly, resources. And that's about financial and non-financial resources, and philanthropy has a huge role to play there. So I want to come back to this point about infrastructure, and then Neera, we'll ask you to tell us more about your work. In our study of social change fields, we see this behind-the-scenes nerve center-like organization playing this often unseen role of stitching together the work of the broader ecosystem. We call them field catalysts, system orchestrators. Sometimes they're in network form. They come in lots of different shapes and sizes. But they're so essential to actually lead to a field that is a whole greater than the sum of parts. In our research, we see these field catalyst organizations playing, sorry, the slides are a little out of order, 3 key roles. They diagnose and assess the field, they connect and organize key actors across the field, and they advocate and shine a spotlight on the issue. Neera, it's so awesome to be sitting next to you. We have studied the work of Dasra for years, and your leadership has just been incredible and in some ways really inspired this research. And so I would love to hear more in particular about the Dasra Adolescent Collaborative and how you think about the roles that that collaborative plays vis-a-vis this notion of a field catalyst and some of the impact you've seen from those roles.
Sure, thank you. And I have to thank Bridgespan for actually bringing lexicon and language to all that we've been doing. And I think it's so important to have these words that we use as an ecosystem. It just helps us sort of pursue this work more collaboratively. So thank you for that. So we did not start thinking we were field builders by any stretch of the imagination. And we're sort of this in-between, a terrible word I'm not a fan of, but people like to call us intermediaries. We like to call ourselves bridge builders. Now we've become, field builders, and now we're system orchestrators. So it's like, wow, that's amazing. But still, it's really tough to raise money to be a system orchestrator. But what I'll focus on is how we moved from really trying to support organizations one-to-one and just recognizing that if you're really going to move outcomes and impact, you do need to have a systems approach and really look at the field. And I think the first opportunity we had was to look at adolescence. And to be very frank, we've been around for 24 years. The Adolescence Collaborative is around 12, 13 years. Now we have a WASH Collaborative, which is about 8 years. So all in all, it's a very long time frame where you're actually achieving outcomes and you start feeling like this field is moving in some direction or the other. So it's been quite slow. It needs a lot of patience, but nothing is more exciting than I think we are all now willing to accelerate and willing to take more risk. And there's a lot more investment in being able to iterate and be that kind of dynamic. So the Adolescence Collaborative started with the simple idea, and much of this sounds simple, but the orchestration actually takes quite a lot of time. And what helped us with adolescence and helps with collaboratives is really situating a common set of outcomes. Because we're trying to really break silos, and the way that funders end up labeling their money is like education, health. In fact, the philanthropy work we do, these are the 2 most popular sectors that families, corporates want to move into. But really, for an adolescent girl to be empowered, she needs to be supported in a number of different ways. And so what the Adolescent Collaborative allowed for is to pool education money, health money, all different kinds of livelihoods, empowerment, agency, because we situated outcomes with delaying age of marriage, delaying first pregnancy, the age of your first pregnancy, really keeping girls past grade 10, and finally looking at sort of life skills and employment. And that just crowds a different kinds of money to come together. And I think the first thing was to recognize that you have to bring leaders together to agree on that, but you also have to bring the funding side. And we did quite a lot of work, and I'm sure others in collaboratives will talk about, is the governance structure, the decision making. You get one mammoth funder to come in, and then they want sort of all of the power to steer it. And there's pros and cons sort of to both of this. So our Adolescence Collaborative has also changed in those 12 years. In the simplest sense, 12 years ago, it was exciting to pool money and fund a portfolio and have a common set of outcomes. But over time, we've realized the power of these platforms really to achieve scale is that they can engage with the government. At least in India, you can't achieve any level of scale without working through government systems in some way with the government. And funny enough, you'll hear NGOs as like non-government organization, but many who have scaled are in fact government organizations, as in they are supporting and in partnership with the government. And so having that platform approach, government has come to us, both state and central, saying we want to come to a platform, we don't want to be one-to-one sort of with these organizations. So I think recognizing, advocacy can sometimes be a dangerous word, but engaging on policy advocacy has been really powerful that we've seen as the Adolescence Collaborative moves on, and engaging, we've learned after 12 years, with girls and their leadership. So how do you move closer and closer into communities, and how do you enable the portfolio and organization to do that has sort of been the second thing, placing girls at the center and the government having access to understanding the needs of girls themselves and whether those policies are working. And I think the last thing I'll touch on that has been the power of the collaborative that we've learned from our adolescence work is narrative change. I know you said sort of advocate and shine a spotlight, but more and more, how are we shaping the narrative around each of these fields? And are we leveraging media? Are we all beginning to speak a language as the collaborative to be able to pursue ultimately those outcomes? We're finding that can actually galvanize and accelerate and sort of build, a lot of momentum. I'll just touch on one last thing, and then you can tell me to please be quiet. I'm finding that the kind of talent it takes to run collaboratives is really emerging talent. And the more I think about whether it's funders, whether it's, NGO leaders, it takes a special kind of individual, a special kind of coming together that I think more and more we need to recognize that, and we need to build that capacity. So we talk about building NGO capacity, then, hopefully you talk about funder capacity, but there's a special talent that will allow us to really, accelerate, these collaboratives. But why don't I pause here?
I could listen to you all day, to be clear. The work is amazing, and one of the things that we've been studying and going deeper on is who are these field catalysts? What are the assets that they bring to the work? And I'll quote my partner who was moderating a session earlier, who was quoting someone else, and she said, when building an ecosystem, you have to deal with the ecosystem. And I think we can all nod and say indeed, and that there's this kind of unicorn-like quality that many of these field catalyst leaders, I don't want it to be true that it's a unicorn-like quality. It needs to be more prevalent than that. We need to figure out how to train and coach up the next generation of leaders to do that work. But it is so much about working back to Liz, your point, at the space between organizations. This is work powered by relationships. And so that ability to develop those relationships and cultivate them and maintain them over time, and deal with that ecosystem and break down the ecosystem. That is so much of the work. I also want to call out, Neera, in your description just now, this notion of kind of grass tops to grassroots and moving across the verticals of our systems and of our fields, but also horizontally. These field catalysts are just brilliant in bringing together other intermediaries, often other NGOs and nonprofit actors, also working with government, pulling in philanthropy and engaging with philanthropy in different ways, but really, as Neera just said, centering those most proximate to the problem. And I was maintaining that centering and focus in building that ecosystem around that shared understanding of the problem and agenda. So Nader, let me turn to you. I know that at the Skoll Foundation, you all have been on a learning journey, really understanding these systems orchestrators, focusing your support differently and supporting them really well. Tell us about the foundation's journey and some of your favorite success stories and what you're seeing from that work.
Yeah, no, thanks, Leah. It's just such a pleasure to be on the stage, to be here with all of you. There's so many examples that we could give. I'll definitely limit it to one for time purposes, but just very briefly for those of you who aren't familiar with the Skoll Foundation, we're an institutional foundation based in the US. And for most of our 20 years, we've really focused on social entrepreneurship and giving them the support they need in order to scale. In the last few years, we've really opened the aperture to not only focus on social entrepreneurship, but to understand social innovators writ large. Really focused in 5 systems now. So that would be climate action, preventing pandemics, effective governance, and more. And so you can understand why this work is just so exciting for the foundation. And maybe just to kind of tease the learning before the example, I think one thing we've seen at the foundation is just how important it is to engage with your portfolio, to listen to what they're saying, and then to not only act, but act in concert with them in order to give them the support that they need. And so I'll give an example in a second, but I'm just so excited to be going after Dasra. I know in the crowd, there's a few others that Skoll are just huge champions of, and just really grateful for your trust and your candor and making the time for us. And so just really briefly, I think the example that comes to mind is AMAN, A-M-A-N. They are, in English, that is an acronym for the Alliance of Indigenous Peoples of the Archipelago. And they are focused on deforestation, reducing deforestation through several of the things you see on the slide. The first is influencing policy that supports indigenous communities. The second is on supporting sustainable land use for indigenous held land. And lastly, it's around cultural identity of indigenous communities within Indonesia. And I think what makes me so excited from just a systems orchestrator perspective is a few things that you both were just mentioning, just to reiterate. The first is that they're trusted, credible actors, not afraid to operate at the grassroots, the grass tops, really bridge different centers of power, even within the Indonesia context. They also are just phenomenal conveners with that organizer's mindset. I believe at last count, they represent 2,200 communities across Indonesia, 15 million people. They have organizations that are part of the platform. They regularly engage government. And they're able to shine that spotlight of the platform on policy change, on narrative change, not only the capacity building at the one-to-one level. And I think that's just so exciting to see, because the nature of the problems that we're dealing with, Leah, that you opened, are just increasingly complex systems, and they're trillion-dollar problems that no organization or founder or funder can necessarily achieve alone. So I'll stop there. Yeah, just so excited to be here, and I think that's one of the main learnings, is just, really engage your own portfolio. You don't have to go very far to see this type of work, and it's in our own backyard here in Asia.
Thank you, Nather. And I will say this notion of field building, these field catalysts doing the incredible work that they do, again, often behind the scenes, you may not have heard of many of them because many work behind the scenes in this nerve center-like role. Some, though, are your point about convening. I wanted to name, AVPN itself is a field catalyst in many ways, really working on drawing more capital into the social sector in Asia, supporting collaboration and coordination relationship development across capital providers in Asia. And so think about this space as field building in the wild, field catalyst work in the wild. You all are experiencing the power of it. I also think about the GIN, the Global Impact Investing Network, is another example that we've studied, really building the impact investing field. We're seeing this notion of field building emerging in Asia, really taking off in other markets as well. I was recently learning about the work of the Lien Foundation in Singapore, who's building the field in many different issue areas, but in early childhood is really homing in on some pilot projects and research and thought leadership to build that shared knowledge base I was referencing. Also the Terra Climate Foundation, some of you may have been at their convening a few weeks ago, where they're explicitly investing in multiple different levers and approaches to solve these systemic problems, and they say in their theory of change, we champion collaboration. So I am thrilled to have Yanni Peng from the Narada Foundation on stage here. This is work that I hope to learn more about and study more deeply, because we are really curious and don't know much about how this notion of field building is taking shape in China. And that is the focus of the Narada Foundation's work. So Yanni, please tell us about your field building efforts in China.
Thank you, Lee. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here and to share our what we have been doing in China about the field building. Actually, I think Narada Foundation, we were established in 2007, based in Beijing. And we started our field building work 15 years ago. But at that time, I think it's not on purpose. We just accidentally, we find out that the newly established foundations in China, we need to learn, we need to get together and learn how to do philanthropy. So in 2008, our chairman at that time, Mr. Xu, he convened a group of leaders from other foundations. We started the China Private Foundation Forum at that time. Now it's 15 years. Now the China Private Foundation Forum became a China Foundation Forum. Now it's an independent entity, an NGO, doing this work to convene the foundations in China, to do capacity building for the foundation leaders in China. So this is just one example. So I think because we call it infrastructure building in Narada Foundation, and this is our priority. And because our mission is to foster the third sector as a whole in China. And we found that we need this kind of infrastructure building because it's kind of public goods that everybody will benefit from it, but everybody tends to think, oh, somebody else should invest in it, so I can benefit from it. Then we think it's our responsibility because our mission is to support the sector. So from that time, we how do you say this? Unpurposely, we invest in infrastructures. And other example is the China Donors Roundtable. I think the CEO of the China Donors Roundtable is here at the AVPN conference. It was a joint effort by Ford Foundation China office and also 4 other foundations based in China. We want to use this platform, this organization to help the founders to be more professional and to be more strategic. Nowadays, the China Donors Roundtable can convene big conference with over 100 donors in China to learn with each other, and they organize this ongoing learning circles and also the workshops, online, offline events for the founders. I would say that this infrastructure is it's very important in terms of building up the professionalism of the founders in China. And also another example is you mentioned Jane. We have Chain, China Impact Investor Network in China. It's an initiative of China Social Enterprise and Impact Investing Forum. And the CEO of that forum is sit there. It was a joint effort by 15 organizations, including foundations, venture philanthropist organization, and academic about 9 years ago, yeah. At that time, at Narada Foundation, we found out that social enterprise is kind of is at the forefront of the social innovation in China, and we need to support it. And actually, because some foundations in China, we are constrained by the policies that we are not allowed to give funding to for-profit organizations. So we need a new entity to support that movement. Then we create this platform, and at the very beginning, there's no CEO. I myself did a lot of work for that, so it's quite some work. And I'm fortunate that we found a very capable CEO after a few years, and then now their target audience are mainly the mainstream business sector in China, the big corporates, the impact investors, the commercial investors in China. So they launched the China Impact Investing Network last year. So during the experience of our experience of supporting these infrastructure organizations, we found out that the flexible and the stable funding is very important to these infrastructure organizations. and so they can allow them to do things that is for the public good of this sector. And secondly, we need to support the leadership development of that organization. After a few years, I think back 4 or 5 years ago, I realized that the capacity and capability of the leaders of those infrastructure organizations will be the ceiling of that organization, because the position of that infrastructure organization is so important in the whole ecosystem. Their capability is going to be the ceiling of the whole sector. So we need to invest in their capability. So after that, we designed a leadership program for them. You mentioned that you build their trust. We in our leadership program, we had this kind of 3-day hiking challenge in desert, you know, for them to hike 88 kilometers in the desert. So it's a very good experience for them. And after that, they built on the trust with each other. And after that, they can form some other collaborative initiatives. For example, in 2020, after when the pandemic hit China, this China Stoner Roundtable, China Foundation Forum, and also the Collaborative Forum for Disaster Relief, these people, the leaders, they talk to themselves, talk to each other, and say what we should do. So they organize some collaborative initiatives. So as a founder, I feel so happy. And I think that now they are at the forefront of this field building, and Narada Foundation, now we can hold back, and we can move our focus maybe to some other new needs, emerging needs, then we can shift our resource to other aspects. Yeah.
Thank you. Yanni, you are truly at the cutting edge. Some of the things you just said, I'm like, that is at the bleeding edge of this work, of this research that we're doing. And what you just said about everyone benefits from the infrastructure, but no one wants to fund it. We have data to back that from a global data set. And it's essentially, you know, Field Catalysts playing this behind the scenes role are systematically underfunded. And you can imagine why. And we actually have a poll to ask you all, what do you think the barriers are to funding this type of work? You named one, which is everyone perhaps sees the benefit of it. Some folks I don't think actually see or have really conceptualized the benefit of it, because it can be really behind the scenes, but you're kind of thinking, oh, someone else will fund it, or hoping that perhaps. And in our research, interestingly, the median operating budget for Field Catalyst in our data set of over 150 organizations is $5 million US. These are lean and mighty organizations punching way above their weight class, and the average budget shortfall that they're facing is 50%. So these are organizations looking to raise $2.5 million US for the next year of work to do massively more, like from an ROI or a leverage perspective, the impact that they have is amplifying the whole ecosystem of actors. So while the case feels so clear to fund them, indeed we're not seeing the funding flow to these organizations. Leah, can I just, please jump in.
Can I just add, though, I
Please.
think the question that you raised before about capability is one of the big challenges. There's a unique capability about people who can see the system and all its threads and build the engine that actually drives the agenda forward. It's a very specific skill set that's about comfortable in emergence and uncertainty. It's about no ego, to your point. And what we found at the Menzies Foundation, we work around leadership initiatives. What we found at the Menzies Foundation is often the foundation has to take the role of creating the preconditions where that sort of capability can emerge. So, you know, people come to us wanting to work on a leadership challenge, and they bring the lens from the work they've done in the past. They bring a not-for-profit lens, or they bring a different disposition. They're used to having to compete with others in the field rather than build coalescence. They're not used to having the freedom to fail, because often this work involves one step forward and 2 steps back as you navigate the complexity. And one of the things that's been, I think, really important about what the Menzies Foundation does is appreciate that it takes time to build the space in which people can get confidence about this capability we're nurturing. We fund all different things around building that capability, consultants to help with theories of change, any number of things, whatever's required to build the container for that capability to emerge. And I just think that that's a long-term commitment. It's sitting as a foundation, being comfortable in emergence and uncertainty. It's not being clear about deliverables. It's having very honest conversations when things go off the rails. These are all the types of disposition, I think, as philanthropy we need to bring to how we cultivate these spaces and position them for success.
Yes to all of that. Thank you, Liz. We will turn it to you all for Q&A, and we're doing it the old-fashioned way. Raise your hand, a mic will come and find you. And so as you think about questions that you want to elevate for our panelists, I want to open up one more poll. Ask you all about the barriers to philanthropy embracing field building and funding field catalysts. And as you look at the multiple choice set on that slide, or on that Slido poll, Liz, the last one is mindsets and bias, because I think there is this piece around the mindsets that we bring in our sector. And this is a fundamentally different set of mindsets and is the prevailing paradigm right now in philanthropy and in the social sector, which I think the prevailing paradigm is very much find a programmatic solution or an intervention. You know, our due diligence processes are set up to find that thing, perhaps with an RCT, you know, level study or evidence or whatever it may be. And this work doesn't look like that, right? And I think we heard some great examples of why this work doesn't look like that. So, Ashim, I need you to unlock your phone so I can see the results of the poll. Thank you. And also would invite folks, as you're thinking of questions, you can. Okay, great. Oh, this is interesting, you all. Okay, Liz, you may have led the audience, but 70% selected mindsets and biases that favor programmatic investment, so that this very different paradigm. The next one with the most votes is lack of understanding of systems change and what it requires, embracing that complexity that you just described. Next one is lack of understanding of field building as an approach to systems change and this role of the field catalysts or system orchestrators. Well, thank you, that's why we're here today. The longer timeline to impact, which also came up. This is work, I think several of you noted this. In our research on field building efforts, the successful ones that we studied were never short of 15 to 20 years, often more. Often, you know, the work started in this relational space before that clock even started. So this is multi-decade, often multi-generational work. Another barrier that you all checked was measuring impact and different approaches to theories of change and impact measurement, which we certainly see in our work. That's actually the #1 question that funders often raise with us as we talk about this work and in our research. So let me pause there and just check and see if there are any questions from the audience. We have a hand here in the front.
Hi, I'm Shiv Kumar from Catalyst Foundation. I had two questions. One is, what about the notion as government as a system orchestrator? Not as an implementer, but as somebody who takes a larger position. I've seen Singapore government do that extremely well. Do we have any examples that the panelists can share? Second is the value for money by investing in system orchestrators. I have typically seen 1:20 to 1:50 leverage when it is an investment in a system orchestrator. Still, why do foundations find it difficult to invest in these orchestrators?
Thank you. Do you want to take?
You should take the example.
Okay. On that first question, this has come up, and I think there's a good lively debate even around what counts or what is the definition of a systems orchestrator or field catalyst. And we, through our research, came across this interesting example from South Africa called SANAC. It's started as the South African National AIDS Council. And this is a really interesting example because across our studies where we used methodology where we asked people who are system orchestrators, who are field catalysts in different geographies, and we had access to the SCOL global network, there weren't many that were government-led, and we weren't particularly surprised by that. Actually, SANAC may have been the only one that actually started with a government-led initiative. There were many others, Neera, to your point, where government was an important actor at the table, But in the feedback and the research, the notion of government leading it was problematic because there's an automatic power dynamic. And if government were capable of stitching together this work in this way, wouldn't they have already done it? Was something someone said to us in an interview, right? Government is not necessarily set up to do this. So we were interested in studying deeper this example in South Africa because SANAC ended up creating this grass tops to grassroots and horizontal across civil society infrastructure that more recently, persisted over multiple decades, addressed the AIDS crisis in South Africa, and then that infrastructure persisted and was a huge part of the COVID pandemic response in South Africa. And so I think of that as one, but really perhaps an anomaly. So I think it's a good question and one we'd want to learn more about.
Yeah, I was going to say that I think the challenge is, and even from hearing how we've answered, is that we've almost taken it, all of us in this field, if one can call collaboratives a field, is we've overcomplicated it. And I think we need to take a step back and simplify it if we want to get others to engage. So the funders who come to the table are fairly sophisticated, large institutional funders. Right? It's the same folks who come into the same collaboratives. If we can simplify it and create a structure that just even allows families to come in, different kinds of funding to come in, I think some of that dynamic is really important, one thing. I think the second thing is we have tended to, with philanthropy, to achieve scale, assume we must absolutely be unified and with the government. I think there is an additional challenge for philanthropy to come in with a collaborative approach where the government is actually not playing. It's hugely risky, let's say in India, right, Shiv, to your question. But there's big gaps in many communities, marginalized communities, for which the government is actually not there, for which the government is actually not even enabling an environment that NGOs can function to provide that. So I think there is a de-risking element that collaboratives can take, but we're not taking that risk because you want the usual funders to come in because it's hard to raise money. Then you want to be with the government because you want to achieve scale. I think all of us in the collaborative space need to be able to say, let's move to riskier places, use the idea and platform so that we're not actually targeted in some sense. I think it's important for us to, push each other to do kind of more of that.
Can I add something to that too? Because in this audience, government's often seen as the place where you realise scale. And yet, in so much of the Menzies Foundation work, government is challenged around innovation and new ways of thinking and new forms of coalescence. Electoral cycles, policy and process, these things seem to mitigate innovation. So in our school leadership initiative, for example, we had an advisory board made up of very senior people around school leadership. And the most salient advice, we were getting a lot of pressure, we should take our initiative to government and get government to scale it. And yet schools themselves were telling us they didn't want government to impose another leadership model on them. That was already happening very unsuccessfully. And John Hattie, who's probably one of the most renowned academics in the world about student performance, said a very salient thing at one of our advisory board meetings. He said, get sharp, pointy elbows in the system. And it completely pivoted us from thinking that getting governments to adopt the intervention that we were doing was the answer. And instead we went and brokered a Silicon Valley partnership to do an EdTech play that offers a completely different way of thinking about scale, a completely different way of thinking about access, so that actually the market's going to dictate how good this product is in developing collaborative capacity in schools. And it's going to be affordable because we can do it and build it for a global market. An entirely different pivot to what government in Australia would have suggested we did in terms of another leadership development, one of 1,500 leadership developments that aren't making a difference. And I just think the orientation so often in field building is to think government's where we're aiming for, but actually multi-sector collaborations, new partnerships with corporates, new partnerships with technology, new partnerships in community can offer a huge array of alternative ways of thinking of problems at scale. And we're in a position to broker new forms of collaboration to unlock innovation in ways that perhaps we're not focused on at the moment.
Maybe I could just add one thing, Shiv. It's good to see you. And just to build, because I think it's a dynamic we've seen in the results from our working with Bridgespan in our survey of actual practitioners, and then also from the funding side as well, the challenges. The one dynamic also is just oftentimes these actors, from what we hear, don't want the public spotlight on themselves. They would rather it be on the network, on the organizations, on whatever issue or moment they're trying to capitalize on. And I think with that, there's a helpful clarity, which is this isn't necessarily your big movement builder out mobilizing the masses to, advocate for change. There are those roles. Some of them do that type of work, but it's not necessary. And I think with that comes a different way of thinking for a lot of funders who can easily attribute change to outputs that are public, that are in the news, that are shiny, or they can go to their board, quite frankly. And not to take away from those moments, those are really important. But I think from what we've seen, especially in the US case, working with government, that's often can be very polarizing publicly. Behind the scenes, you're able to get so much done because you're not pandering to this larger ecosystem that we work within. And even though that's a US takeaway, I feel like a lot of us around the world, also in Asia, can relate to that kind of operating environment. So I think that's been useful for us to at least acknowledge that this might be a little harder to see than what you typically would when you're doing scoping and landscaping and whatnot.
Right.
We work with Indigenous women in the Kimberley who are around empowerment and entrepreneurship. The one thing they tell us is they don't want more government funding that imposes solutions on them and that emphasises deficit and disadvantage. They want the opportunity to generate wealth to change their lives for themselves and their community. They draw in the therapy, art therapy and music therapy we do, they tell stories and they draw pictures with big black holes that represent government departments that are orchestrating their futures. So I just, we've spent a lot of this conference also talking about trusted philanthropy and lived experience, this idea of people imposing solutions, not surfacing the lived experience of people. The Indigenous women that I work with tell the most horrific stories about the challenges they face in their lives, and yet they articulate the greater good in ways I don't hear in other spheres. And as I said, government for them is not the solution. And I think that's an interesting thing to think about, to your point, about other ways that philanthropy can orchestrate places to leverage other types of thinking, other ways of thinking about innovation to unlock the potential of the people we're meant to be supporting.
Yes. Thank you. I think we have time for one more audience question. And okay, see a hand right there. Then I'm going to ask each of our panelists to give you all one practical piece of advice. Just one.
Thank you. So it's an interesting topic. So my question regarding the people and the leadership competences. We're talking a lot about the field building organizations. Which kind of competences that we are looking for the leadership for these organizations? Because they have significant role. They work with allying people, bring the people in the ecosystem together, having vision, sometimes raising fund. So from your experience, which kind of competences that we are looking for leadership for the field building organization? And what is the pool or source of pooling that we could take the succession leader for such an organization?
Thank you. Yanni, can I start with you? Because from your stories, you've helped get a lot of these organizations off the ground.
Yeah, I think quite a few competencies. The first of all, I think is the system thinking. Of course, for the field catalyst, they need to look at the field from a system perception and where are the players, who are the players, and what are the differences of those players, who can do what. And so this person, the leader should have a very strong system thinking. I think the first one. The second one is more about the courage, I think. It's, as a leader, because it's really difficult to build a field. It's really, and it takes time. You mentioned 20 years, 15 years. Yeah, I think in China at least 10 years. And because it's hard to measure the impact. It's not like that you have the direct service to the vulnerable group. You can see the results from the recipients, from the end users. And this is really hard. So it's very hard for the leaders to get the direct, how to say, direct response from the field. So he or she needs to have the courage, needs to have the persistence to work on this. And also another one is to be open-minded, because it's everything can happen, and every day is a new day. You can have new challenges, and you never know what will happen. And you have all this new technology coming into this field, and you have new comers. So this person must be very open-minded, willing to accept their failure and to admit their failure, and willing to share their story, willing to learn from others. And I would say these three maybe.
I might add, I think there's something that I've thought about, but perhaps the first time articulating, is the perception of neutrality. So you're not really neutral, but everybody needs to feel that you are neutral, and it takes an incredible effort to remain the perception of neutrality. And with that is the other skill of really being able to negotiate. There's so much politics, to be honest, that's involved, whether it's the power dynamic, whether it's the language, where's the resources, and being able to do some of that one-on-one, yet build consensus into the group, I think is a really important skill of that facilitating and coordinating. I think the other is to really keep impact at the center. So it doesn't matter who you are, where you come from, but everybody needs to align that ultimately you're trying to achieve X, Y, Z. I think if you can just keep reminding that, by the way, we're really here because we want girls to stay in school. Right, then everyone goes, oh, okay, yeah, we forgot about that. Yes, we want to, that's right, that's really why we're here. I think some of these softer things are really important for us to remind each other why we're there, obviously in addition to all of the other skills like building a spreadsheet and doing PowerPoints and writing and stuff like that.
In our research, we see these field catalysts have 4 huge challenges to their work. One is funding, we already talked about that. Another is measurement, we've kind of talked about that. A third is balancing the various competing priorities inherent in this type of work. And the fourth is talent. This came up in our survey data as one of the top 4 challenges, talent, leadership. And so we hope in our research to go deeper on each of those 4 challenges in the coming years of our initiative. So before we wrap, let me turn back to my panelists and ask them for an encouragement, a practical word of advice for this audience, and in particular for funders in this work. Nader, do you want to kick us off?
I was going to say, are we going reverse order? Because then Yanni can go. No, I'll be very brief, and also my answer to that last question. I know I said earlier about listening to your portfolio. A shameless plug is to the Bridgespan work that is being led on field building, where they talk about origin stories, and I think that's my other practical piece of advice is credibility. And when you're evaluating credibility, it's not necessarily the fancy words that you're using, those plans for the future, it's what you've done. And I think that's what we've seen in a lot of these origin stories, especially from our portfolio, is just our entrepreneurs have evolved over 20 years. And so now they're moving beyond maybe that one-to-one organization and adding that capacity in that organization, or moving on and letting that organization continue to thrive and focus on scale in that other way. So just take a look at those origin stories, but I think that's been a very practical reminder as we look in our own portfolio again at where are these actors.
Yeah, maybe to share with our founders to I think to start. You can start now to invest to support the field catalyst. It doesn't has to be a very significant amount of money, but you have to be very patient and also to be very persistent. So, for example, our Narada Foundation, we have been supporting the China Foundation Forum for over 16 years consecutively, and it doesn't cost our grant a lot. Only if you look at our annual budget, it's a tiny part of our annual budget, but you need to keep doing this and be involved in their strategy making and to connect them with other funders and other field actors. So you will never regret it. So the words to other funders, you will never regret it, because I have already seen the fruits.
I was at a conference in Chicago last year, and the Grant Makers for Effective Organisations talked about, the CEO talked about, Marcus, the illusion of altruism, which has stayed with me ever since. I think, to Yanni's point, I think the one thing that philanthropy needs is more courage to interrogate its own practice, more courage to hold itself to account, more courage not to stand behind processes and grant-making procedures, more courage to accept the skill sets they need to cultivate to sit in genuine collaboration. That conversation so often derailed around this power conversation that, you know, philanthropy in some ways shouldn't deeply collaborate in these platforms, but I ask myself all the time, how can I be instrumental in building platforms or system orchestration if I don't deeply understand the issue, if I don't sit with the people with lived experience, if I don't leverage the expertise of the people sitting around the table. I just think philanthropy itself needs to challenge itself, or have the courage to challenge itself around how it contemplates collaboration and build the skill sets, the nuance, the ambition, the courage to step into those spaces in new ways.
I guess I would say that as we move towards encouraging sort of more collaboratives, more platforms, and you know, Mahatma Gandhi says this much better, you know, than, I don't remember his quote, or than I will, but like, close your eyes, right? So everybody close your eyes for just a moment and, you know, think about the most vulnerable person you know, somebody from the community who doesn't have access, doesn't have the privilege that you do. And now you can open your eyes, that when you enter into the collaborative work, are we really placing that in the center of all that we're doing? I think will keep us true to the kind of change that we're trying to have, and sometimes we forget about that.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here. Thank you all for being here. As we wrap this session, see if I can get us to our last slide. How will you move to action? As I said at the outset, we see field building, and our research indicates that field building is a container for a lot of the big ideas we heard across the sessions before this one today. In every session I was like, yes, field building is a way into actually collaboration in that way. Yes, field building is a way to view relationships in that way. And so if in this session and if in your work you see field building for systems change as something you're doing, that you want to learn more about, that you want to contribute to and press on the broader philanthropic sector, reach out to Nader, to Liz, to myself. We are going to open our table of funders to a few more who see themselves as champions and living at the cutting edge of this work and want to learn together, write together, and influence the broader sector through this effort. And at a minimum, I hope that these stories and the insights that were shared today made y'all curious about this field building lens and how this work may already be alive and well in your own funding portfolios or in your own work as a field leader. And so would encourage you all to talk to each other about it and reach out to us to learn more. Thank you for being here. Enjoy the rest of the conference.
And that was the panel session, Achieving Impact Beyond Scale, the Imperative of Field Building. Thank you so much, Leah, Elizabeth, Nadir, Yanni, and Neera. Thank you so much, ladies and gents. Now we will perhaps have a group photo on stage, if you will. Yes. In the meantime, ladies and gents, we're going to take a short break. A late PM break, late afternoon break, refresh and refuel. And the next session will happen at 4:30 PM.